you don't actually have to agree that evolution is true to be able to recognize it's not in conflict with Adam and Eve is laid out here. You can still, I mean, I'm not trying to argue with you that evolution is true. If you want to know why I think it's true, I'm happy to explain it. That's not what this is about. I'm just saying that if it were true, if you want to imagine an imaginary world in which evolution is true, does that mean that Adam and Eve couldn't be there because it's in contradiction? No, it doesn't. It's not in conflict. And it goes the other way too. If you're here and you're like, you know, I'm a Christian, I think it's all a myth, it's nonsense to think about this, or I'm an atheist, I think it's nonsense to think about this that way. Well, okay. You don't have to believe that Adam and Eve are real to recognize that it isn't in principle in conflict with evolution, right? So let's kind of walk into this. I'm going to give you a scenario that shows how all 5 of these things can be true at the same time. You're kind of curious how I'm going to do this trick? Well, what's really critical to understand about the Genesis tradition, or the way how most people have read Genesis, is that it doesn't actually give you the whole story. There's lacunae, or gaps in the story that people fill in different ways. And one of those gaps is this question mark, which I call the mystery of what's going on outside the garden. A great deal of attention is put to explain that the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve are, and in the Fertile Crescent somewhere, that it had borders, right? It didn't extend across the entire earth. And if we're going to take a literal reading of Genesis, the teaching of Genesis is also that there was death outside the garden, because that's how death comes to Adam and Eve. So if there was no death in Adam's world, that maybe that's true within the garden, but the actual teaching of Genesis is across the world. There was animal death and death among people even everywhere. But the question then becomes, like, were there people outside the garden? And people have been wondering about that for a very long time, it turns out. Long before evolution. One way to read this is kind of like maybe a naive young earth creationist reading. There are less naive readings too, where you kind of basically say, well, Scripture doesn't talk about it, therefore it doesn't exist. And, it doesn't actually clearly say that there were people across the globe, therefore there was no one. And you can certainly take that view. I mean, I could say that, with a little bit of, squeezing, you can make that consistent with Scripture. There's definitely some troublesome passages. That's one sort of traditional reading of Genesis. But another one is to say that there were people outside, that Adam and Eve, when they fell in the garden, they exited the garden and encountered people out there. And their offspring ended up interbreeding with those people outside the garden, and they quickly became ancestors of everyone across the globe. Isn't that cool? And now you can see how this actually resolves that paradox if this works out. We haven't worked out the timing issue yet. We'll get to that in just a moment. But you can see how God could create an individual couple within a larger population, right? And that population interbreeds with other. That's like kind of the story of one lineage out of which we arise. But then there's these people outside the garden that we descend from too, that God created by this process, a common descent. So in the same way, there's no contradiction in saying I descend from my father and I descend from my mother. There's no contradiction in saying that I descend from Adam and Eve, who God created without parents, and I also descend from people outside the garden that God created by some process of evolution. Does that make sense? That solves that conflict, both of them really. How it could really be true that Adam and Eve were created without parents, and we also share ancestry with the great apes.